A long time ago, there was a small, remote village tucked away deep in the woods. The villagers rarely spoke about the dark corners of the forest, and visitors were warned to stay clear of the old paths, especially after dusk. But one autumn evening, a group of young friends, curious and adventurous, decided to ignore the warnings. They set out for a weekend getaway in a secluded cabin that stood at the very edge of the forest. The cabin had been abandoned for years, or so they were told, but there was something about it that felt off. The air around the place was always colder than it should have been, and the trees surrounding it grew unnaturally tall, their twisted branches blocking out the sun. But despite these unsettling details, the group of friends felt a thrill at the idea of exploring the unknown. They arrived in the late afternoon, and after unloading their bags, they started a fire inside the cabin. The flickering light from the flames cast strange shadows on the walls, but they shrugged it off as nothing more than their imagination. As the night fell, they gathered around the fire, telling ghost stories, laughing and drinking to the peacefulness of their surroundings. But as the clock struck midnight, something changed. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, shaking the cabin, as if something was trying to break in. The friends fell silent, listening to the distant echoes of what sounded like footsteps. But there was no one else in sight. "I'll check it out," said Carl, the most adventurous of the group. With a confident grin, he stood up and walked toward the door, but the others begged him not to go. They had all heard the rumors about the cabin, how people who stayed there vanished without a trace, how the woods seemed to swallow anyone who dared to enter. But Carl didn't listen. He stepped outside into the darkness, the door creaking shut behind him. The others waited in silence, straining their ears for any sign of Carl. But all they heard was the wind and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open, but Carl didn't enter. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "It's not just the wind," he whispered, barely able to speak. "There's something out there, watching us." Before anyone could ask what he meant, the wind suddenly howled louder, and the cabin's lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. The fire in the hearth sputtered, its flames shrinking. The group huddled together, their hearts racing as an unexplainable sense of dread settled over them. "Did you hear that?" Sarah, one of the friends, whispered. Everyone went still, listening. From the corner of the room, they heard a faint whisper so soft it was almost a breeze. "Leave now." The group froze, trying to pinpoint where the voice came from. But there was no one in the room. Their eyes darted to the corners, but everything seemed still. The silence was deafening, until suddenly the door slammed shut with a force that shook the cabin. Carl lunged for the handle, but it was stuck, completely locked from the outside. Panic spread through the group. They scrambled to the windows, but all they could see was a thick, suffocating darkness. No stars, no moon, just endless black. "Let's go," Mike shouted, pulling at the door again, but it wouldn't budge. Then, out of the corner of their eyes, they saw movement shadows slipping and sliding along the walls, shifting unnaturally. They turned to face them, but the shadows melted away before they could react. The whispers grew louder. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was not from anyone in the room. It came from all directions at once. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in on them, as if the cabin itself was alive, hungry, and closing in. Suddenly, they heard the sound of heavy breathing. It was low, deep, and rhythmic, coming from just beyond the doorway. But when they looked, no one was there. Carl, shaking with fear, turned to the group. "We need to leave now." But when he tried to run to the back door, he stopped cold in his tracks. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through him. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its hair hung like cobwebs. Without a word, it stepped into the room. The friends screamed and tried to back away, but they were trapped, unable to escape. The figure moved closer, its eyes locking onto each one of them. As the figure raised its hand, the temperature in the cabin plummeted. The friends could see their breath in the air, and the shadows around them grew long and twisted, stretching across the walls like dark fingers. Then, with one final whisper, the figure was gone. The fire was out. The lights flickered once more before dying completely. The door finally creaked open, but the friends were too terrified to move. They could still feel the presence watching them from the shadows, as if it was waiting for them to make the wrong move. When morning finally arrived, the group had vanished. The cabin stood silent and empty, surrounded by a forest that now seemed more alive than ever. The only trace of the friends was their abandoned gear, scattered around the cabin, like they had vanished into thin air. Years passed, and people stopped coming to the cabin, but the whispers never stopped. It is said that the woods are still haunted by the souls of those who dared to stay, and if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can hear their voices calling for help, trapped forever in the dark. The cabin remains there, abandoned, waiting, and if you're not careful, it might just call to you next.